What a book.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everybody.
Did you guys all listen to that Beatles album we were supposed to listen to this week?
Abbey Road. We all got here for the Abbey Road podcast. Love it. I don't know why Django chose Abbey Road, though.
Were we supposed to listen to Abbey Road?
No, that's just the only Beatles album I could think of.
I did listen to that a lot this week, but unrelated to
Did you?
Daytripper.
Wow.
Yeah.
Isn't Daytripper a B-side or a single? It's not on an album, I don't think.
Yeah.
That's why Django made that joke. I didn't get it. I didn't get it. But
not why I made the joke, but
too deep. Yeah.
I'll take it. You know, what's
happening.
Hey, everybody. Rhett, good to see you for 2 weeks. Keep it up, buddy.
Welcome.
Well, hey, everyone. We're here, and thank you for doing this to yourself. I hope that everybody had a good experience doing that to themselves, or at least a cathartic experience doing that to themselves.
Jeff can neither confirm nor deny whether I did.
A lot of ambiguous emotions there.
Yeah, I read this the first time back in January, and I've been trying to make other people read it with me, and so I was pretty stoked. But it was like more emotional the second time.
So
yeah, this
who
was
else had read it then. I mean, Emily, Django, Jeff, and so first time for me, Will, Wayne, and Rhett.
Nice. Yeah. I'm trying to get Andrew in here. I kicked him out earlier because I admitted him too early, and I wasn't ready for anybody to see me flounder around on the computer. But
did you get that other thing floundered around with that we were working on?
Sure, I did it with 30 seconds to spare, dude.
That's my guy.
It's probably fine.
Let's get Andrew in here.
Can anybody tell me that, I'm assuming that it was me and Jeff who had the absolute edition. Could anybody else tell me how they would pitch this book to get it published? Because it was published by DC, and that's like, all right, Superman goes in space and he punches a dude until he punches him out, and then he punches him into the sun, and then
he's got a kid.
How do you make this book? How do you convince a major publisher to make this book?
Or does anybody want to just do a 30-second pitch on what this was? Because even as I reread this, I'm like, what is this?
Meditation on mortality is the only thing that, or honest meditation on mortality is the only thing that I could come up with. The main character paperback
has a job writing obituaries, and the first issue is the last day of his life, and so is the second issue and the third issue.
They're all different days.
Bummer deal. The fact that this book exists, I think, is a thing that I'm incredibly grateful for, but even rereading it just sort of was like, I don't know how this thing exists or was allowed to exist outside of the fact that it is just like 10 perfectly executed issues. I can't imagine anybody getting these on an editorial desk and being like, nah, but even still, I don't know what the proximity of this and like Umbrella Academy would have been. Because maybe doing art with Umbrella Academy could have had them the name where DC would just publish anything that they would put out. But
Birdway did a little blurb for it.
Yeah. So I wonder if it was afterwards.
That's a good question.
So, Jeff, you're asking about the pitch, and I'm really curious about that too now that you say it, because you're not pitching 10 perfectly executed issues. I don't know how you get somebody on board for that. It's basically saying, like, I got a pretty terrible idea, but I'm going to do it perfectly and it's going to be transcendent. Like, trust me.
I think this book, beckons less for like an issue by issue, like then this happened. I'm curious just everyone's perspective, but in what you just said, you mentioned it's a horrible idea, but I'm going to do it perfectly. And I'm curious where that horrible in there comes for you, because this is not like just a purity book. It's not like All-Star Superman, which is like, here, have a bunch of good feelings. This is something else that is supremely beautiful. I'm curious what the horrible aspect is for you.
Horrible in the sense of how poor it is to pitch, which was more going off of what you said, because I think horrible, there's very little to grasp onto, unless maybe when you're pitching it to DC, the pitch has much more to do with the logistics of the book, of saying what Wynn did. Like, what if we did the last day of this guy's life throughout all of this? And maybe the editors didn't grab the book because they knew it would be transcendent. They just said, oh, it's cool, like the last day of a guy's life a bunch of times, and he might be dreaming or something. And maybe that was enough to get it published, because what else would you really talk about for more than like 30 seconds, 10 seconds?
Why do you think he died in every issue?
I took that as every time he felt like his life was finally getting started, it was also ending at the same time. So for me, it kind of tied a bit of the, like, you know, being present in your own life and not always feeling like, you know, you got to get out of somebody's shadow, or you got to meet the right girl, or you got to get the right job. And so every time, like, an event that seemed to happen, and maybe that's not true for every single issue, but it felt like a lot of it, where every time something was happening significant for him, where, and it even said it in one of the books, in one of the books, you know, maybe my life will finally get going now. But it felt like that idea resonated through all of the stories, that, you know, he finally thought his life was getting started. Whether he was 30 years old, he was, you know, 11 years old, you know, or 70 years old, his life was about to finally get going to where he wanted it to be, and then it ends. And to me, that kind of spoke to the idea of, like, you know, get out of your own head of just feeling like your life isn't started, because you're living your life right now.
I love the way that you brought the idea of simultaneous endings and beginnings, because I didn't realize that kind of is a through line in every aspect of all of it. Whether it's his son being born on the day his dad dies, or him being born when the power is out, or even like getting the letter from his dad at the very end when it's, you know, the opposite time to be getting that letter. It is simultaneously an ending and a beginning at every point, which is an interesting theme to have executed so fluidly throughout everything. Will, before we got 2 weeks ago, you texted me and you were like, we're going to read Daytripper. You guys talk a lot about Daytripper. Do I want to buy the absolute edition of this to read this book? And I was like, I kind of hesitate to have anyone buy an absolute edition of a book that they haven't read. I'm curious now, looking back on it, do you feel like it would warrant an absolute edition?
$100 is still tough, but at the same time, I would have pause, because I think when I put this down, I thought for myself, was this the best thing I've ever read? And if you know, if you're going to get an absolute edition of something, it might be something that you're at least asking yourself that question. So a hard maybe. I like that. I like that.
You know, one thing that one through line that I saw in each of I would say 7 or 8 of the deaths was that each time he died, it was right after an event that he would have regretted not doing. So, like, he would have always regretted not turning around to find his future wife in the
all of those
store.
Decisions are, yeah.
And he would have regretted for the rest of his life not chasing down George.
And he did regret it all the time.
He regretted it until he did it, and then he died. And I don't know if that was what they meant to do. I don't know if that was like on purpose, or if that's just my kind of obtuse reading of it, because it's not totally consistent. It's not every single time, but it was a lot.
Mm-hmm. It definitely, to me, felt a lot like a comic exploration of the idea of, you know, live every day like it's your last.
I agree.
Because when, kind of like what you're saying, like every time he makes those decisions in that direction, it's, what if this was the last decision I made, was to not do this or to do this, like whatever the opposite of what he ends up doing was. And it's like, well, it would suck. So he does the thing, and then that's the end.
Mm-hmm.
Really latched on to like the storytelling inherent in the obituaries. Like, I mean, death is pretty much always surprising and senseless, even when you see it coming. But we have this tendency to try to tell a story. Like, now that we know this is the end, we see a story arc there. Whereas if he just kind of kept living past that part of his life, it's, you know, maybe not all that meaningful. And I don't know, it made me think about like times in my life where stuff felt really chaotic, and maybe I've had the thought that like, whoa, if I died now, like there's no narrative arc. Like this is the middle. It's all messed up, but that's just how it can be. But people tend to look for meaning after the fact.
I had such a similar thought in an existential hole like 3 weeks ago at night, where I was just like, if I die, like I don't feel like I'm ready to die right now. My life's not done. But I was like, but I think it will all, like, every time you die, it's going to feel like that. That's always the thought, right? It's always like, oh shit, this is it? Oh, dang. I didn't know. I thought I was going to be able to have had this finalized more.
There's some famous last word, and I can't remember who it is, but they said something like, but I wasn't finished.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's it.
Yeah, the like death is always untimely. So saying untimely death is just a weird thing to say.
I think that's an interesting storyline, because in one of the last stories, or the very last one, he's just like, I did it. You know, I've accomplished. I mean, he didn't like reflect on specific accomplishments, but he was just like, I'm ready. You know, and I don't know if that was just him just saying, I'm done, you know, fighting cancer, or, hey, my life's been great and I'm ready. It felt like it kind of punctuated a lot of those other times whenever his life was interrupted. He was kind of just ready to go.
Yeah, that's true. He was never ready until the end.
When
I think he was, even when he said that, and maybe that's just my interpretation of it, he wasn't, even when he said he was ready, I didn't think he was ready, because there was, you know, kind of a bit of that through line as well, was him, you know, his relationship with his dad. And so him saying he was ready, but then he got that letter from his dad.
Oh,
and
you're
then
right.
he went, it's like, then he was finally ready. And like, that's even how it finished on the last page, is like, that's it. That's checking all the boxes. I'm finally ready now. I've, you know, fixed this, or, you know, accomplished what I wanted to accomplish for my dad, or, you know, however you want to interpret that.
What a lucky guy to finish his arc.
So I
Emily,
had a
yeah.
Okay, on the question that you asked that we were kind of just going off of there was like, why do you think he died in every one of them? And I don't, even hearing you guys talk about it, I don't think this is as right, but this is how it made me feel. Some books, when you read them, it is clear that that person had an idea or a story and they're trying to tell it, and it's almost like they just have to do it for themselves or for like the sake of whatever. It felt like he had to die at the end of every issue, because that was for me as the reader to properly understand what I'm reading and to get in the right mindset, like required that death each time. And it was cool for a story plot, and it really is the ultimate thing that tied everything together. But when you get to the end of the second issue and you realize that he died again, and it wasn't just like, oh, that was a main character and this story is about a different one. I think at that point, once you get just 2 issues in and you see another death and you start thinking, I'm gonna have to look at this at the end of every issue. Then at the start of issue 3, you're starting at waiting for him to die, which is the most mood-setting thing I've ever read.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you just spoke a lot of truths there. So going back to that thing where I alluded to sort of like, there's a portion for me that is terrible, and that terrible part is that in every issue, at every time, you're kind of waiting for, like, there's a masochistic nature of like, I'm reading this and I like this, but like, I know it's about to hurt every time. And that's a scary thing. My first time reading the book, which was probably 8 years ago, I finished it and I was like, yeah, like he dies at every end because he writes eulogies and that's his way of processing his life. But upon this read through, like him being somebody who writes eulogies felt like a smaller portion of his life than it did my original read through of it. Because the second read through, which is now 8 years later, you know, Django mentioned this because the first time he read it was not an insanely long time ago. But he mentioned beforehand, like, yeah, like the way that the timelines of romantic interests and jobs line up are really interesting. And the way that it stays internally consistent to that, I think is really fascinating because it's so out of order, but you can see like, oh, there's that painting. They must have gotten this painting between age 35 and 37 because it's on the wall now. Yeah, like I don't know. It felt like a different mechanic to me. And I didn't necessarily know. The first time I read it, it felt like the easy mechanic. It was like, oh yeah, this is the way that he understands his life. But now I look at it and it's a lot more like being on acid or mushrooms, and you're like, wow, every single part of this book is like a beginning and an end, and like all of it completes his life while also being the singular moment that defines his life. There's this weird like overlap of all sorts of themes. I don't know. I processed it very differently this time than the first time.
How's your explanation
I-
of the actual dream scene stuff? Like, I can't be the only one who's like, that was really great, but I don't know that I knew why it all kind of.
That's totally what I was about to say.
okay.
Actually, was I noticed this time around it really stuck out in the second episode or issue, and then the dream one. That those were the only two times that there were kind of magical realism. Otherwise, it was actually very like real world literal, and especially with it being the second one, the one where they go where'd they go? Where they go to the water festival and he drowns. And there's kind of that ghostly man who takes him out in the boat. That's the only time there's like kind of a fantasy spirit besides when he's clearly dreaming. I was just really curious if they kind of started that way and then abandoned, like, no, we need to stay more grounded in reality, or if it was intentional. But then the dream world comes back at the end.
I don't have an answer, but I also had a question I was excited to pose related to the dream stuff. And yeah, I guess so. In the second issue, I puzzled at whether or not that was sort of like there's a spirit kind of like enveloping that guy, but I was like, is this real or is this a dream? The second to last issue is kind of overtly a dream fantasy sequence. Now get ready, Django.
I read it
because you like this book.
I do, and
I think it affects you. And you're notoriously not a fan of dream sequences, but I imagine that one was palatable. And I'm curious if you would be willing to unpack your relationship with that issue, which is, in general, the type of thing that you're not a huge fan of. But I can't put my finger on what it does well, but I think it does something well that makes it not shitty in the way that those can be shitty.
Yeah, so it was definitely not my favorite of the issues. The last two were probably on the lower end of the issues for me, and I'm notoriously uninterested in dream sequences. This one didn't really check the boxes of dream sequences that bother me, and a lot of times that's, you know, like whatever you imagine when I say walking around on a Mobius strip. That's the kind of dream stuff that I don't like. It feels super weird and kind of trippy and doesn't make sense. But in this one, it feels a little bit more like the movie Synecdoche, New York, where you're very grounded in the real world and weird things are happening, but they're just kind of happening. So like when his wife is filling up the sink with water and it starts to flood the house.
I love that so much.
It's just a thing. And in Synecdoche, New York, he's buying a house and the real estate lady is like, well, yeah, I mean, that fire is always there on the kitchen table or whatever. and you just accept it as part of reality. And so this dream sequence I thought was really good because it was giving us his thoughts and emotions and memories through a dream, but they never, like, nobody ever started floating off the ground. Nothing ever got wrong colors. You were just in bizarre, choppy circumstances. And maybe that's because that's more like the way I dream than, you know, floating through space and having an Alan Moore scripted conversation.
It's your anchor to reality you have to have. Like you keep talking, like you talked about in the first volume of East of West. Like it's just, there's something to make it a bigger deal. By the way, I can't believe I just found this in the 10 seconds I was looking, but anyone else notice the issues before that? We got that like weird, obtrusive foreground of the couch.
Oh, I loved that panel so much.
There was nothing else. Like I was like, all right, I'm gonna look 2 pages ahead. Nope. Okay, I guess that was just a thing. And
that's
then, of course,
just the kind of stuff that
later
makes me giggle and glow inside when a cartoonist is just like chasing their sort of view or expression of reality. The dream sequence to me, I really liked because so much of this book feels like a meditation on mortality, like Nathan had said, but it's also about memory as well. And, you know, when we are remembering things, there's not like a boundary between scenes or times. You sort of just flow from a memory to a memory, kind of anchored by emotion. So it did this thing where we had all these very concrete compartmentalized moments of life, and then we have this sort of summative moment of life. And the reason it is summative is because it kind of reflects on the life that has come before it. And that 9th issue kind of lubricates that transition between concrete moments and kind of what it is to just sort of slide between them all.
Yeah, and having him at the end kind of get up out of bed and like go for one final ghostly walk was really well done and pretty impactful for me.
That's where I started crying.
Okie dokie.
I would love to hear everybody's favorite issues, like the 1 or 2 that like affected you, not just like brought you to tears, but just like, I think that this book has the ability to make people feel. And I think that it does it in a versatile way. And I was surprised by what made me feel a lot this time. And I'll start, so I'm not throwing everybody on the old stage. And also don't, if you don't want to. That is the Comics Place way. But
did you say dad is the Comic Place way?
It's super not. But that actually is a question I want to talk to everybody about with this book. I love this book, and I remember like being at the comic shop and recommending it to folks because it just like makes me cry in a really wonderful way. And I was curious if this book, I had an ex-girlfriend who I remember like telling to read this book because it's amazing and it made me cry. And they were like, it is good, but it didn't make me cry. And ever since then, I've had this sort of, but also this read through, it's very much like fathers and sons and their sons and, you know, female romantic interest. And I guess I'm just really curious. This time through, I was trying to be like wary of, is this a universal book or does it feel really male centric? And, you know, I don't know. 5 of us are dudes, but I would love, you know, does it feel that way? I mean, that's what I thought about. Does it feel that way to any the other guys here? Like, does it feel emotionally fertile for all folks, or am I, by being a guy and this being so many male-centered characters, am I kind of blind to eating the thing that it is? I would love other people's thoughts on that.
It definitely got me like this. It got me different the second time than it did the first time. As a dad, there's plenty to identify with here. The first time I read it, we didn't even know my dad was sick. And this time, like, my dad has had cancer and died. So there's like, there's a lot of new stuff that really gets under my skin in this reading. And I can't tell you if it's universal, but I can tell you that it was impactful and got me real good both times in different ways and for different reasons.
When I just posed the question, while you had your head,
most of it, my battery was dying.
Okay, cool. I'm just curious if this book feels universal or male centric in the emotional beats that it hits, and I want it to be universal. But it was written by guys, starring guys, about a guy's life and fathers and sons, and I just am very interested in, you know, what am I subjectively reading into, and why do I like things?
I guess for my part, like, I haven't in a long time had any sort of relationship with my father, so I couldn't really speak to that.
Yeah, me neither. Yeah.
I guess like some of it, like the idea of like legacy, like, you know, his father was an author, so in some ways that influenced his decision to become a writer, and like him wanting to live up to that. Like, I mean, in the first issue, like, he feels like his own birthday is being overshadowed by this gala that he, like, I don't think we even actually see that it's his birthday until like almost the like 2/3 of the way, 3/4 of the way through the issue, when George has left that birthday card on his desk.
Mm-hmm.
Other than like we get something someday that's big and important, but before that, as far as like male centric, like I mean, the main character's a dude. He's had like part of the thrust of the thing is about like his relationship with his father, who is of course also a dude. And like aside from the I think it's issue, what is the issue number on that? I'm sure I just flipped back.
Which one?
It's the issue that he doesn't actually appear in.
Oh, is that
8?
8? Yeah.
Yeah, aside from issue 8, like you don't really see a lot of the women in his life. Aside from them being kind of set pieces. And
Right.
Mm-hmm.
like obviously that's a negative connotation, and we could go all day about, you know, like the sexy lamp test or whatever you want to use as your metric on female characters. But like definitively, I think regardless of its intention, like it has to be seen as male centric, but I also don't feel like that needs to be part of the conversation.
So it didn't, yeah,
it didn't
I guess,
feel like a detraction. Like I feel like if this were about a woman in her relationship with her mother, like it might be a slightly different dynamic, but I feel like a lot of the story beats would still have been the same.
Yeah.
I guess I love so much art so much, and it's increasingly more important to me to know like what art I love allows other people to feel on the outside of it. And given some conversations, I'm just curious where people fell on that. So I appreciate you talking about it, everybody.
I thought there.
Oh, sorry, Emily. Yeah.
I was gonna say, if I think about it, like the same exact book with a female protagonist, it probably would get marketed as like, this is a lady book, you guys, which more speaks to just kind of how we normalize like male characters as universally relatable.
Right.
It's not this book's particular issue. It's just kind of how we're all taught to empathize with male characters. But I definitely, like, my connection to it was way more about the themes around parenthood. So the ones that were most impactful for me were the one where the mom was like, when he was traveling and the mom was like getting the calls, or even the last issue when they're elderly, which I've not experienced yet, just like him kind of reflecting on his relationships with his son and his family. Like that was kind of the stuff that got me this time. But I was reflecting back to like more my 20s and dating and all that stuff. That felt relatable also.
Yeah, I read this 8 years ago as just a sprightly 22-year-old who was only freshly into the waters of treasure.
What did you know?
Exactly. And, like since then, my father's had just horrible dementia and Alzheimer's. And, that seems to me like an event in my life that marked that like now was a time to read this book again. An ocean of experience has separated who I was and who I am now. And another really important ocean of experience that seems to exist within this book to me is the idea of parenthood. So I'm very eager to like reread this when I have a child myself. And not having a child, I cannot imagine the way that like, these issues hit folks. And in the Absolute Edition, there is an introduction by one of the brothers, and he kind of states that point about it, which is I just hope that it's a thing that people can read at different times in their life and get very different things out of.
So far, so good.
So for me as well, so far, so good. And I think it's the kind of thing that could have years between it or just months between it.
I'll tell you what, the issue where they have the baby, like I tried to explain that to Erica yesterday, and as I was explaining, I was like, man, this is kind of a convoluted mess of a plot. And also I'm driving down the road trying to explain this comic book and starting to cry, just saying like what happened to who and when. And the thing at the end that I didn't notice probably just because I was reading too fast or crying too hard, was that it's his book that's on his dad's desk.
Yeah.
When he's and I didn't notice that until like one of the last couple of issues. I recognized the book cover. And like, so then I had feelings about that issue a second time, 5 or 6 issues later. And it was just like, holy shit, this book has a lot of interesting kind of references to itself that are really subtle and give it a lot more meaning if you miss it on the first round.
It shows up in the side portion of a panel before it's been introduced as what it is. Like there's an issue where he has already written it and it's just around. And I remember it's iconically black and yellow. And the first panel that it appears in, the L isn't, you can't see the bottom line of it. So I spent like 45 seconds being like, what is this word that starts with SII?
Same.
And so it really stood out there. And then, you know, because it's been 8 years, I totally forgot what its role was entirely. But yeah, but that happens. Like I like that in issue 1, you know, his wife, we just see her jaw, and it's a little bit like, oh, I wonder why that. And then in issue 2, we meet the longtime girlfriend, and you know, I had to go back and be like, wait, is that her skin tone? No, it's not. This is a different person. Like I liked even your statement of like, it is kind of a mess of a plot, kinda in the way that like, if I were to try and tell the story of my life right now through like 12 key moments, it would be kind of all over the place, but it's also like remarkably internally consistent. And I read it with those eyes, having talked to you, Django, about like you just mentioning how impressed you were about how well things are placed. It's like the emotional equivalent of Dave Gibbons drawing a pin on a desk in The Watchmen, and then 2 issues later, you seeing that same pin on that desk.
Well, and even in the dream sequence issue, I don't know if you noticed, but in the background, there are all these screens that have some version of a heartbeat on them. So like they're showing a flight path and there's a heartbeat.
I equated all of them to heart. I didn't realize what they were doing until you just said that. That's very cool.
Yeah, his mind is like coming up with reasons for those noises that are happening while he's having his dream. I thought that was really cool.
Doctors in the background in the at first I was like, oh, people wearing masks. That was now, and I was like, no, wait, it's doctors.
We had the exact same response.
In a hospital. Yeah,
I didn't notice that.
I only saw the masks, and I was like, "That's weird that people are wearing."
Like masks. I completely just did not even notice until you mentioned it. I'm like, "Oh yeah, right. Yet again."
You know who noticed that?
That wasn't normal in 2010.
Mike noticed that. Mike's out there like, "Oh yeah." 2010 didn't have masks. Yeah.
The thing that tipped me off that that something was super wrong, other than the water filling up the kitchen in that one, was when he was looking at all the people that he had to write obituaries for, and they were all him and his family. That kind of gave me the chills.
Yeah.
In that same issue, the dream issue, I loved so much the line that says, "Life is like a book, son, and every book has an end. No matter how much you like that book, you will get to the last page and it will end." And then that's they're kind of like looking off towards his dad, and then he kind of looks down at him and hands him something and says, "No book is complete without its end." I took I don't know why I did this, but
that's a good page,
yesterday, buddy. Yeah, and so I had that on my mind a lot, and then I don't know, the word die, death, something came up with my 3 and my 5-year-old in the room, and I asked Teddy, I said, "How old do you think you're going to be when you die?" And he's like, "I don't want to die." And then Lucy said something that was basically like, "I don't want to die too." And then we were left with this thing, which is like, that's how we all think. That's how kids think. That's our instinct. And so then it spouted out. I wasn't planning on this, but I was like, but guys, life is like a book. No book is complete without its end. And I don't know if I planted something or if that was just for me, but it was like flowing out of me, like I did my like daily scripture reading of like, oh, I'm emotionally in touch for a hot second, and maybe I can share this with you children.
That's what art's about, dude. That's what art. That's all art is. That's like the most holy part about art, is that for like at some point, at some moment, you feel like you have a sense of truth that you can share with somebody, and it's fleeting and no one has it. But like wow. And this book, I think, does that for me. Like, it I'd forgotten all of these lessons from this book, and then to just, they're important life lessons you can extrapolate from all this. They're not given to you. You have to extrapolate them. And because of that, they, you pull different things out at where you're at in your life. And they're universal lessons that I think need to be taught at all times.
Well, and your kids are going to either remember that for the rest of
Fuck
their
yeah.
lives, or forget that you ever had that conversation, and you're the only one who's going to think about it ever again.
And it's still
Hard to say
planted
which.
too. I think like it's the more I hear about even pre-age 3, there's just so much emotional groundwork being laid that will not be remembered factually at all. But there's so much going on before that, and I don't know, it helps me be cognizant of that.
The issue that I was really nervous about getting to on this second read, and I don't really know why, and it didn't devastate me in the way that I was worried that it would, but the issue where he goes to find George or Jorge, like,
Yeah.
That's one that got me the most, other than the very end. That issue I think was my favorite written one.
It was like, I kept kind of just being like, is this the one? And I don't know why it had that air to me, but it was one that I was like nervous about getting to. I'm curious, how did everyone feel about that?
Like the time where life felt like it turned on its head the most. Like, kind of everybody's had like a dad die, or like I don't know, but your best friend going stir crazy in the desert and shooting you is a little jarring.
Yeah, and you know what the weirdest thing is for me, with given this emotional division of time, I've, between the time that I've read the first, this the first time and the second time, I've actually known like 3 very close people to me have very similar things, which is why I think I was so nervous about going into it. It was the thing that, like, I can point to more people I care about having episodes like that than I wish I could. And I think maybe that was one of the reasons I was so scared about it. I can relate to that more than a parent dying at this point. So maybe that actually, you saying that really does highlight maybe why I was so nervous about approaching it.
That story was terrifying.
Yeah.
That story was terrifying to me. It felt really out of place, and it's interesting. I'm just having like this challenge right now with a friend, and it was only whenever you just mentioned that it really kind of created that parallel that, going through this emotional challenge with this person, and then that just, it was just so shocking. I never saw it coming, and then when it did, it was just like, what the hell is that supposed to mean?
Yeah,
and it really just came down to, like, it was just one more thing, like the absolute love of a friend, jumping on a plane and going wherever it is and walking aimlessly into the sand to be able to find your best friend, to be able to rekindle that friendship. It's such an important thing. And so, that was very shocking to me.
That's the craziest part, is that that's the thing in the book that Bras, wow, I can't remember.
Sure. Yeah. Bras. Yeah.
That was like more outlandish than everything else. Like, it wasn't just that him getting killed by him was so jarring. It's that, like, the thing that set it up was like, oh, that's like the most set you apart from other people thing that you maybe did in this entire book, and that still, like, got you killed.
Well, and the death right before it set it up too. Like the plane crash, like, made you yearn for that friendship, and then it rolled right into the next story. So it just had all that anticipation. Sorry, Jinko.
Really good point. Really good point.
That's right on. Those two were almost like the only 2-issue arc in the series.
I was just gonna say that same thing, kind of, except for 9 and 10. I feel like kind of needed to bookend, and then the 2 with the plane crash and
the thing that I kept thinking of with George was that his, like, starting in issue 2, I think it was, which was when they were like 21 and on vacation, just going through the world. That made me think of my son Max, who's 21 also, and I was like, oh, these guys could be Max going out and just having a nice little tour. And then to see a few issues later, there's my proxy for Max, and he's gone totally off the deep end. That was an interesting kind of bummer. Like, I wished at that point that I hadn't attached Max to his best friend.
How did that coincide with your feelings once like the last page hit with the like someday you won't need me anymore type thing?
I think that the final issue, I think I read a lot more selfishly than that. So I read it as Bros / me getting a letter from my dad 40 years from now. Right. And that had more impact for me than, well, I can't even say it had more, because there was the middle part with his kid, and that stuff got me pretty good too. So I guess the last page was about me, but when he was hanging out with his kid and saying goodbye, and like his kid didn't know that he was probably going to die real soon. That part got me in the kid feels, and the end got me in the dad feels. So I don't even know. I don't know if I would handle it the same way as him or not. I might not tell my kids that, I was about to die if it was that soon and I hadn't adjusted to it yet. And, I think he's a lot more like his dad than he realizes. And I just, yeah, I've got no idea.
I'm sort of surprised, like the first time I remember finishing this series, the final issue, I just remember being like weeping. And I was definitely affected at different points reading this volume. But right now, where I'm at in my life right now, the sort of emotional jump of like, you don't need me, and that kind of being the final statement of the book wasn't exactly what, that wasn't the emotional catharsis that it was several years ago. And it also wasn't the emotional, it might be a way more impactful thing in my life later. And that's why, I want to spend $100 on this dumb book, is because it is the kind of thing that I think is important to check back in on.
Mm-hmm.
Because like who you are at a given time and just what you had for breakfast is going to kind of affect what you're emotionally pulling out of something at a given time. Sam and I, my partner Sam, we had a very busy day. It was an excruciatingly dumb, busy
Did you just
day.
gesture towards the closet?
No, the door. The door is right here. Well, she's actually, the living room is that direction. So it's probably going to the living room. But I kept like, it was a friend's birthday. We brought a gift to him. We forgot the gift. We had to go back home, get the gift, a different thing, bring it back to them. Then I had to like go to the grocery store because I missed grocery stores last week, and I don't want to be the partner that's not doing that stressful thing as well. All of this stuff. But the whole time I was like, I've got to make sure that I'm giving way too much time to Daytripper for all of this, because it's like not a book you just casually read. Like, don't read Daytripper if you're trying to shove it all in you in 30 minutes, right? Like,
I read it until I cried for 2 issues, and then I gave it a break and picked it up again until the same thing happened.
Yeah. I didn't have that amount of time. I read it between yesterday morning and tonight. But I had 5 issues today, and I was worried all day about how much time I needed to give to those 5 issues. So like, I was at the shop doing work today, took a half-hour break to make sure I read one of the issues, because this book was not going to be served to read 5 issues in one sitting when I had 2 hours. Like, it needs to be a thing that I digested at different moments, and that affected what I got out of it today. And I think years from now will affect what I get out of it. But I do think it's one of the very few pieces of art that I think is like, a light prism that you can shine a white light into, and it'll break it up in all the different colors. And, where you're at in your life that day affects which piece of the spectrum that you see. And
there's a name for that.
Yeah.
And Mike would know what it is. What the heck?
Like we need Mike here to tell us that we're wrong about everything.
Any side you look at it from, it's different.
Yeah.
Just hearing that, I mean, I started reading this, I don't know, like 2 weeks ago or something, because I just, I need to take time to read it, and I have like sporadic moments with the kids running around. Nathan probably knows, like just finding those moments where you can sit down and read where you don't have 50 other obligations going on.
I think Win and I are maybe the only ones who don't have that, but
you can speak for yourself, sir.
Oh God, I forgot that Win and Ren have kids. I don't know. I don't
have children, but I do have a 10-hour day job. So.
Oh.
So just
Day jobber.
finding that time to squeeze it in, and I was on I think chapter 4 or 5. It might have been when he was a kid and playing or something, but it was just the idea of like don't miss life was resonating with me, and just finding those quiet moments to be able to do it for a few minutes. And my kids were playing video games and my wife was doing something, and I was like, oh cool, I have a few minutes, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to start reading. And I got like 3 pages into it, and I'm looking at my the message is hitting me, and I'm looking at my kids playing video games, and I'm like, if I don't close this freaking book right now and go play video games with my kids, I'm missing the point of what I'm reading right now. And I had to stop at that point in time and pick it up later and just read it at night. But then that's a mistake too, because that's when I'm like the most emotional, is like reading at night. And it's fascinating to hear all of you guys talk about the books that the different ones that impacted you the most, because the one that hit me the most was the one that he's not in, with his kid. And I mean, there's all sorts of stuff going on with that, like that hits me, where I've been a workaholic for forever and always been on business trips and traveling all the time, and this type of idea, this fear, like has washed over me too many times, being on like work trips where I'm gone for a couple of days and something like this happens. So like this is the page that broke me. Like,
oh God, I was
don't show me that.
Will, that issue fucked me real good, and I don't know how or why, but I think I got either the page before or after that one, like right there as well. Like I was shocked.
I mean,
by it.
They nail everything, because the art is fantastic with the kind of the doe eye, and you can really sense the mood of the kid, where he's sad but also has this pride of his father, and is just distraught about it. And then 2 pages later, 3 pages later, the kid goes and gets the puppy, and that entire issue was the toughest one for me. The rest of it, kind of just wrapping it up, was I like the ending, it was all beautiful, but like that issue right there is one that just I think will stick with me for probably the rest of my life.
What I just realized is that that kid has a last letter from his dad 70 years before Bros found the last letter from his dad.
Yeah, or many years. Good right? God, you're right.
Sorry, didn't mean to bring that up.
No, I just
sucked
did
all
the
the
math.
air out of the room.
I was distracted because I just did the math. The brothers were 32 when the first issue of this came out.
How? Like this is universal beyond a 32-year-old's.
I guess that's my point of just like, why eulogies, why dying at the end of every, like, why this book, why 2 twin brothers? Like, how did we get so lucky that this book exists? Because I feel like we haven't even touched on the art of this book, but I feel like every panel of this is a gift that was given to me. And I feel like that the most, I don't know why this is what stands out to me, but in issue 1, I think that you see the weird book frame, the bookshelf that is on their wall. It's like a bunch of weird squares together. And just throughout the series at appropriate times, that bookshelf is there. And Django, like you always, mention the Dave Gibbons Watchmen thing. And like the internal, but to me, that was this of just like, there is no physical space in this entire book that the writer and artist, these 2 brothers, didn't live in to draw it. Like everything down to the the panel that you showed, Nathan, of just the tea kettle on the boiler and why the fire is there, why we see the ass of that zebra painting like 2 issues before we see that there's a zebra like all of those decisions, like like bands talk about, Modest Mouse has a song where the computer got fucked up and there's this weird sound that comes through on the recording. And they were like, but that's what music is. It's not what you put in, it's what you decide to stay in there. And that's what this book reminds me of over and over again, is just like, why it's brilliant. Like it's either nothing at all and they just drew a zebra's ass, or it's like the most brilliant artistry I've ever seen in my entire life. The way that they chose to put that stuff in there.
So this is from the Absolute Edition. That is the bar that he dies in the first issue.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And we never see the bar from that angle.
Oh no.
So he drew this is the kind of thing that I imagine Chris Ware does when he's drawing a room. He has to draw the entire city block that room is surrounded by. And I think that Gabriel Ba did a lot of groundwork outside. Like when you look at his sketches for the bartender, he's got like 15 sketches for the bartender, and I think you only see his face 9 times in the whole book. So like he put a lot of work into each character, even if they're just there for a minute or two.
The spirit of the water from that celebration that we don't physically see, you know, like, that kind of stuff. And is why the Absolute Edition is worth it.
This was 2 years after the release of Umbrella Academy Volume 1.
Okay.
So they did 6 issues of the Umbrella Academy, and then like they do talk about the way that they pitched this book to DC in the Absolute Edition, and it's really interesting. They've got like, you know, a quick phone conversation, and then they've got a 3-paragraph treatment, and then they've got a script for the first scene, and then they've got a full script for the first issue.
With the series proposal, you know?
Yeah, with like 9 of the 10 issues kind of described loosely, and some things change between when they come up with the ways that he dies and when they actually write the book. It's a really interesting study in how something this intricate gets put together, kind of like that watching the Watchmen book that Jeff gave me a little while ago. It's like, these things don't just happen. Like there's a lot of work that goes into it.
This was the same colorist that did Gideon Falls too, right?
Dave Stewart does everything. He will do the first arc of Batman and Robin with Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely. He's
I haven't heard anything about that.
Hashtag Batman in quarantine.
But you know what I was interested in this time is that, you know, Nathan, you're totally right. I mentioned on the podcast just recently that like I don't always love that the first issue of series are double-sized. I like it sometimes, I don't like it other times, and there's a lot of business decisions that go into this. This book is a book that I think that you need the first 2 issues of to be able to, like, the first issue doesn't tell you enough about what all of this is.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't tell you anything about what it is. Like Teresa, I'm actually getting Teresa to read this, who doesn't read comics at all, and she just closed it and was like, "Oh, that was a little weird. I guess I didn't expect the main character to die." And that was kind of it. Like, there's nothing else much to talk about at that point. So you're absolutely right on that. That you just got to have the 2 happen. And now she's read the second one, and it made a lot more sense.
Like a year ago, you were like, "What is a comic that Teresa like? What's a comic that Teresa should read that is not like all of the other comics?" And I was like, "You should do Daytripper to read together."
So when you asked a question of basically kind of like you asked the question of Emily and Wynn a little bit, and they both gave answers, but I wanted to ask this of them in a slightly different way of like, all right, Teresa basically said, all right, I've read two issues of this book now. She is incredibly in touch with her emotions. Her name should be whatever Django spelled backwards is, and that would be really cute.
The opposite of Django's inability to be in touch with his emotions.
Yes.
Ognagid, Nerhob.
Thank you. Wow. And we talk about that a lot in terms of comics. So like when she reads a comic, she'll open it up and there's something that like we would talk about together and be like, can you believe that page turn and the thing that was said right there? And it means something to us. And it's almost as if like some of the comic book medium itself is like what emo music, like what Hawthorne Heights was to like music in general. It's like it's giving emotion to like a reader base that maybe in general is not as connected to that emotion. This is not far and across the board the case. But in this, it felt like I read this, I flip to the last page and break down. She reads this and says, that's really good. This is the life I'm already experiencing all the time anyway. There's talking about death, connecting with emotion, thinking about people dying constantly. And I wondered if like maybe there's just the female stereotype at all of like the being connected to emotion because you're taught through nurture to connect with emotion more, if that changes the experience with this book, that it's not as jarring, it's not as new for some people.
So like this is blindsiding the dudes who have been trained to hide it and shove it down.
And it's doing it in a way that's palpable for us. You know, it's emo without the Hawthorne Heights. It's an artistry version. It's not cut my wrists and black my eyes. It's something that actually means something. And I don't know. I'm interested to see what Emily has to say because I know she's got she has kids. And yeah, so.
I'm thinking really hard about that kind of. I mean, I have a little bit of a gendered take on it that I kind of already shared, but thinking about the like emotional catharsis side of things. I am a person who generally consumes media that isn't super emotional or depressing in the like I don't like to consume very realistic media. Like I read the news every day, a lot of news, and that's about all I can handle. So this is actually, for being like one of my very favorite comic books, I pretty much only read like sci-fi, horror, and adventure comics. So I don't know if I have a great answer because it's like I have to get like psyched up because it's really uncomfortable to read this. Or movies where I know I'm gonna like Synecdoche, New York. I watched it once. It was super emotional. I can never watch it again because I like get too trepidatious about starting it, knowing what I'm in for. So I might not. I feel like in my relationships I'm emotionally literate, but I have a hard time intentionally putting myself through the ringer with media, so I might be a bad case study there.
Well, you said the word uncomfortable, and that's I think what the difference might be, is that you were uncomfortable, which is consistent with how I felt. Teresa doesn't read this and feel uncomfortable. She's like, oh, you're putting me in this place I'm constantly trying to get out of by going to the bath with a glass of wine because all I ever do is think about death. And so I have to be on my phone making a story for work, making a story for personal, and watching TV with you in order to not be thinking about death. And I wonder how that person reading this would feel. And that's Jeff on the like, is this universal question? That's what made me think of it.
Hey, Wynn, what were you just gonna say?
I was just gonna say, like, I'm as far as media I consume, like I like having catharsis in my media. I will often like go back to things that I know have made me cry. Like, I don't know how many times I've read The Fault in Our Stars, knowing that I'm going to start bawling about 2/3 of the way through. Thank you, John Green. You stereotype. But like, I go back to those things and know that like that's a feeling I want to have, and I like having control of that just because like so much of the world I'm generally a pretty empathetic person, so I generally in my real life throw a lot of walls up against that kind of vulnerability. I don't like that without me being in control of the situation. Like when I'm trying to have a heart-to-heart with a friend, I'm really more of like, oh, can I offer you a sarcastic comment or a meme in this time of trial for you? I'm really more inclined to be the like, how can I make you slightly happier in this harsh moment rather than have a really hard conversation?
You know, it's.
But yeah, so I don't know, like beyond my own experience, but some of it might be that just like that's how I grew up. I just was raised in a way that I'm a little more emotionally available, even if I have like since then put up those walls. But for me, a lot of the time when I go for something that's cathartic and has like that like moment where I'm like, okay, now I'm going to cry. It really is more about like expecting that moment for me.
I you know, just and Nathan, the way that you were talking about that whole conversation, but so I'm the youngest of 4 kids. I have 3 older sisters, and both of my parents were school psychologists. So I've always just
never
been
had
like,
a chance.
I've always described myself as like socialized female. And then I realized, because, and that to the point of like, you know, I'd had sisters and I was a highly communicative home. And I thought that meant something at that time. I didn't realize at that time that I was like still a male in a world centered on males. So even if I felt socialized in a different way, like I was still being catered to in so many different ways. But even still though, because that was my upbringing, I I had that exact same the way that you're describing Teresa while reading this book. This second time for me, the first time I was really at the very beginning of a transitional phase in my life where I was like, I used to be like, show me how difficult life can be and let me experience that. And then when life started to get really shitty, I had this opposite thing where I was like, oh, maybe I don't need that because like I have a lot of that now. I have a good friend whose name is Danny and I love him. And he's always talked about the importance of escapism. And that was a thing that didn't register to me in a meaningful way until I was in my mid 20s because I didn't have anything that I needed to escape from. So I was watching things like Brick and, you know, Requiem for a Dream and American History X and all of these things, you know, that are like, you know, hostile to yourself in a certain way. And now I'm not a person that can take that stuff in. I don't want to, and I don't even have the ability to as much. And I certainly have things, you know, like Wynn was describing. I knew I was going to cry in this book and I was looking forward to it. But in the midst of this book, I was like, wow, this is a hard thing to knowingly being engaging. Like at this point in my life, I spend all of my time trying to be like, what are the positive things to distract me from this? Where when I was younger, it was like, things are good. What else is out there? Pain, 9 Inch Nails, you know, like, yeah, it's a very interesting, that was an interesting switch in my approach to this book between now and 8 years ago that I didn't quite even place until sort of Nathan had started that line of questioning. But, you know, it's that question of, you know, is it a male or female thing? I don't know. I have always felt really, really, you know, in general, dudes scare the shit out of me, and I've always had a way easier time like getting along with girls because I've had sisters, and that's just been my life. And guys are scary, and you know, and all of that. So, your description of Teresa and all of that, I was just immediately like, that's how I feel about all of these things.
Yeah, I mean,
I have.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say I have to ask Nathan because if I channel our friend of the show Andrew, who never made it back apparently.
Hotspots.
I kicked him out and he could never log back in. I'm sorry.
Shots.
I think I recall Nathan calling in about forcing his wife to read Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man number 6.
Yep, I remember
so, do you only make your wife read emotionally devastating books, or do you give her
It might
other
be
books
the
to read
issue
as
here,
well?
my friend.
Why is that?
But maybe that's that question of gendering a thing. Maybe we're a bunch of like dudes who are like, we just want people to like our comics and my partner to like my comics. Maybe I have to find the thing that is outside of the you know, this is this like universal thing, which is also sort of like Sam, my partner, read this book and liked it very much. And I was just talking to her while prepping dinner and finishing it. And I was like, you read this like when we started dating, right? And she was like, yeah. And I was like, I would love to hear your thoughts on this again, because I have very different thoughts now, and I just want to know what you think about it. Yeah, it is bizarre.
I think I've gotten into the habit of just recommending something that, yeah, you think is like, it's like, you know, first time I walked into the store, it's like, what would you like? Like, what are you into? And like, I'm not
baby
playing the stereotype here, but like talking about talking about DEATH. That's like, in a way though, it's like Teresa and I both, but her more like loves just putting on Queer Eye and being like, I just love watching emotion and people feel stuff. And so that's like, oh, Spider Bite, like that's perfect for that. You enjoy emotion. She grew up in a home that was super connected to emotion, which was the opposite for me. And they celebrated it. And I think that's probably the connection between those two in there. But this does feel like a celebration of emotion, and that's not always what we're supposed to feel in comics.
I mean, these are those are the kinds of comics that I try to pass on to people also. Like, no matter who it is, if somebody wants to know what comic they should read first, if it's not, you know, like one of my favorite sci-fi books or whatever, it's going to be something that had an emotional punch, which would be Daytripper or Spider Bite or Batman Annual #2 from last year. You know, I wouldn't hand somebody all the way down the other Batman Annual, or I guess it was Batman.
Whatever. But
like
your point is right. We started the podcast this week by me saying something about like Strange Adventures #2, and I was like, we don't normally say that everyone should read this book.
Yeah.
But everyone should read it. And you're like, well, it is. I was like, because it's the best thing coming out. And you're like, well, it's definitely the most literary. And then I was like, well, it's definitely the most nominatable for an Eisner. And it's this question of like, okay, well, like, why do we like, why is it different than other things? Is it because it's literary? Okay, what makes it nominatable for an Eisner? Is it because it's like what
it's
what is
medium
good or bad?
transcendent is I think what you're touching on there, and that's what Daytripper is doing. It's literary, and once upon a time there was stuff that came out 20 years ago that was Frank Miller was like literary or medium transcendent with like how weird and terrible and dark stuff were, and then it's not anymore. And I guess people haven't accomplished Daytripper since then, to my knowledge.
I hope this doesn't become like the usual. It would be exhausting to read Daytripper,
right? I mean,
every comic.
Superheroes were the medium transcendence in the 1930s.
Yeah,
and then that's just what it became. So
it would be hard to hit this level of like catharsis, I think, on a regular basis for a lot of things.
Unless you're Ice Cream Man.
I was going to say Mr. Miracle, but
yeah, different type of catharsis for me. But again, I'm not a parent, and I think that's a difference on.
Oh, I just call it crying.
I get that from Saga also. I feel like it's so popular for a reason, because you're just like, oh, it's super weird. Everyone has 5 arms, but I'm just really relating to how tired they are with their new baby. Honestly, Daytripper and Saga are the 2 comics that I really like lobby for my husband to read, because I'm like, we can bond over the parent feels.
Over the baby stuff.
And touching on what you said, Nathan, I think that it's less necessarily the gendered thing of like, hey, a male representing like, here's a female should read this thing. I think that it is like cathartic on such a primal level that it transcends a lot of interest. It's not like, well, I like superheroes. It's not like I like sci-fi. Like, we're getting down to these really core issues. It's way more about being a human being.
And I think that's
absurdly
generic somehow.
But it's right.
Yeah, because everybody's got a best friend. Yeah. Everybody's got a dad. A lot of people have kids. A lot of people have a partner. Like at some level, you can identify with almost like at least half of the main things that are affecting this guy's life.
It's both shallow and hyper specialized in terms of how well it has been done. And I think on that note, I want to hear anything from anyone else who has something to say about this book that is not Django and I, especially not me.
I just had one question that I was trying to settle in my head earlier, but issue 2, because you're saying it feels like it needs to be issue 1 and issue 2. I almost felt like it needs to be issue 1, 2, and 3 because of the lack of clarity on when he dies.
Totally agree.
And so I still felt like at the end of issue 2, I was like, well, okay, what's going on now? And then issue 3, I think, is when I finally could put together the idea. But when does he die in issue 2? Does he die when he first goes out for a swim and meets the girl in the boat, like way back at the beginning? Is it like right at the
fell out of the boat?
I was wondering if it was supposed to be kind of magical realism, kind of, what was that movie, Waking Life? I got that vibe from it, but then they kind of abandoned the ambiguous stuff as they went on.
Well, because he has the weird sexy dream with her saying, come find me. And that kind of has a dreamlike quality to it. So it makes me think that he might have died before that, or he died at this point, but maybe he just died at the end. I can't for the life of me figure that out. And I'm hoping, since Mike's not here, one of you guys can fill that role.
I will say that, sorry, I didn't love that issue the first time I read it. And I was kind of excited to talk about number 2. I didn't care for it. I was like 22 at the time, so a year older than him in that issue, or maybe the same age. And, was a person who had only been in a long-term committed relationship at that point in my life and really rejected this idea of sort of like what George was proffering of like, let's go meet a bunch of people. And also this just sort of like falling in love with someone's foot from underwater. I rejected that as a younger person. And then now being 30 and reading that, like the idea of this sort of fictional goddess embodying the call to awakens oneself to the world of being outside of themselves was like a metaphor that I got way more now than I did the first time that I read it. And I do wish there was a little bit more closure about when he died there, but maybe there's something to be said that like he died when he decided to answer that call because he then pursued a relationship that was destined to fail. And there was inherently a fallacy that there's a lot of metaphorical things you can do with that. But
I think he just fell off the boat and died.
I think that's what happened too. I think that the
ghost behind the guy who was piloting the boat just gives you a little bit of anchor to the idea of the goddess under the water, because that comes back again later, even to the point where he puts the 3 candles in the sand, just like the people on the beach have in the final issue. I think that the ferryman there had some sort of spiritual mission, because he doesn't even seem to care that Bros fell off the boat. Like he's not even looking the direction that Bros would have fallen.
So he's actually on this boat by himself and then falls in the water, and this just
maybe
I don't know. I'm with Django outside of the fact that I think he just fell out of that boat. I think that I think there was a ferryman there. I think it was there. I think that the statement of like lots of people died on these things, like you fell in the water, you looked underneath for too long. I don't know. We didn't notice that you fell out, so we didn't look for you.
I love that we didn't have an answer personally, because we get 8 deaths, kind of, right? Because there's a dream in the last issue. So like,
yeah.
In that, it's like I'm glad it wasn't just like bang, obituary, and playing with the order of things a little bit made me feel a lot more comfortable, because when you start an issue, it wasn't just like, all right, once I turn to the 22nd page, I'm just going to see death. I kind of like that there was more going on. And also, I was going to say, man, the underwater foot, I thought was like, I was there on that.
That's like that silent issue of East to West for Jeff.
Something hit me that was like, oh my gosh, that's one of the coolest things I've ever seen, to like capture that like 15-year-old at church camp vibe of when you like see like no version of this person, but there's something magical about it. That was like, man, yeah.
Did you go on the internet and Google and look for the original art to purchase of that frame as well?
It's one of the only pages that I considered, that and the cover of the 10th one, which I thought were both great.
I had the cover to the 10th one 100%. Speaking to your point, Nathan, that scene of just like the family on the farm, we haven't touched on that issue at all, because like it's both the most wholesome but also like the most distant. And that like him like kind of kissing his cousin. I think it was his cousin.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. What?
I loved that. I loved that so much now. And because of what you just said of like that, it doesn't matter if it's your family or not your family. Like when you go to church camp or when you go to camp or when you go to band retreat, you're experiencing the larger life that is outside of the nucleus that you know. And that moment where you are experiencing how large and how many opportunities there are in life that are outside of what you know, that moment, everyone has that. And it's different for all of us, but it is profound. And I think we hold on to it all the time. And I think for him, that was like, realizing a romantic, anytime kissing, just sort of like that, the way that it showed half of his head fading into oblivion behind the narration box. It's just sort of like, yeah, thoughts. We all have them.
Uncappable intrigue. And that's what the foot did for me.
Yeah.
And in some of these, it's like you just, I don't know. Yeah.
I love how that's when he like realizes people get older, and you kind of, maybe it's because of the age I am now, but I'm noticing his parents, who in every other issue are either elderly or quite elderly. They're just like young people doing their thing, but the kids are totally oblivious to the fact that they're living their own lives. But then you go on to see the rest of his life. Like that got me for being in my early mid-30s.
I think
like my kids aren't going to remember when I didn't have gray hair, Yeah. They're going to look at pictures and be like, well, my mom looks so cool.
Yeah, I shaved my head to get rid of my gray hair.
We're going over, everyone. So we gotta get out of here. However, I could talk about this book forever, and I really can't impress. Like, I have occasionally been able to get people to buy copies of Daytripper, and they seem to like it when they read it, but it is not a book that I recommend to a lot of people in a comic book store, even though it's one of my favorite books of all time. And to have gotten to talk about this book with 6 other people is phenomenal. It's the most number of people I've ever been able to talk to about Daytripper at once. And I think it is not an easy emotional journey to go on. So the fact that, 5 of you have never read it, and did that for this book club is so awesome. And my favorite episode that we've done, and means more to me than in East of West, even though I love Hickman. But it means a lot to me that everyone did this and talked about it so openly and talked about this book that means a tremendous amount to me. And I buy as a big, dumb hardcover to honor the fact that I'm going to read this book in 10 years, and I'll probably read it 10 years after that. And I think it's important. And, they advertised this book 2 years ago, the hardcover. This version was supposed to come out 2 years ago, and it didn't have enough orders, and it got canceled, and then it got resolicited, and it was canceled, and it was resolicited again, and it came out 3 weeks ago. And, having 7 people here talking about it is very cool and very special, and brings a lot of my life together at a point. And I think that's very cool. So I'm very grateful for everyone for doing this.
You're welcome.
Yeah. It was cool. I'm not going to do any more power plays of books for everyone to read. It's Django can pick the next ones for sure.
I'm glad you did. It was a phenomenal book. So I'm glad you did.
I hope everyone enjoyed the journey.
Nathan, find something light for Teresa to read.
Give her Lumberjanes.
Yeah.
Very good.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
I just want to mention.
Yeah, Rhett, please. Rhett.
Quick,
no one's
Rhett.
going anywhere, Rhett. Please, yeah.
All right. Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to mention one thing that I thought was that most resonated with me about this book was that I found it hugely inspirational. After I read the second and third books, I felt like it really pulled at me to go, these are the moments in life that are worth living, and you have to go out and make everything of every day. And that's what resonated with me the most. And then the last thing was the issue where Ross wasn't in. I absolutely adored, with some of the other romance that was going on, the little love notes where there was signs of him everywhere, and that just really was touching and reminded me to be that those things are important. Those little things are really important in life.
Good call out on that.
The moment where he says, they said I need to do therapy, chemotherapy again. And I said, no, I'm done. And the way that his wife looked at him and smiled and teared up was like, your silent panels, Gabriel and Fabio, are the most telling silent panels, pregnant with so much emotion. But of the 7, all 7 of us, it seems like I went on a walk with Sam last night, and we looked at the sunset. And at one moment on the sunset, I thought back to issue 2, where, the girlfriend that he meets is talking about George, and she describes him as out there taking pictures. And he's like, that's a guy who's taking full advantage of life at every moment that he's living it. And that just I was on the bridge looking at this sunset with Sam, and I was like, I've got to be that, I've got to be more present in every moment of my life. And the fact that you mentioned that, and someone else mentioned it, the fact that a piece of comic book art can cause people to have those changes in the way that they're looking at life. That's why this medium is important. And that's why, stories are important. What Rhett just said, what everyone has said during this, I love it. I'm sorry. I love all of you, and I love this, and it's good. And Daytripper, I needed to reread this book, and I'm very grateful you all came with me. So thanks
for putting it
Please
together.
don't go full George.
I'm not gonna take you down, Django. Although very self-righteous to think that you would be my bra.
Oh, okay.
Really
I'm
unpack
leaving.
that one.
All right, bye everybody.
Bye,
Thank you all
everybody.
very much.
Bye, guys.
Bye, have a good night.
Thank you.